Hello and welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political talk show shedding light on things that matter in the Middle East. Foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council, a union of the oil-rich monarchies of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar and the UAE met Tuesday night and agreed that though they weren't getting everything they wanted from the US, they are going to build on what they are getting. They want this to be the first of a regular summit, with the next one in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia next year. Meanwhile, in Yemen, Houthi rebels are accused of violating Yemen's ceasefire, but Saudi Arabia says it will stick to the truce. And here in Britain, the Conservatives have won against all odds, as the BBC claims. I don't know which odds they mean. Mr. Cameron is in for another term, only a week after his victory. The Prime Minister is adamant in a crackdown on extremism, which will be part of the Queen's speech this month. First of all, I'd like to welcome our guest here at the studio in London, Mr. Robert Olds of the Bush Foundation, and Mr. Hassan Al-Katib, journalist and political analyst. Thank you very much for coming as well. Mr. Olds, let's start in Britain and with what's happening with the Conservative win last week. And, you know, the other media outlets were saying all the time against all odds. So how come the odds didn't really, they weren't really predictive of what is happening, of what happened with the results?
Well, many media outlets within the UK are really left of centre, and they have a liberal left bias and are not necessarily in favour of the Conservatives. But there was a lot of polling information which was suggesting it was going to be a hung parliament where no party has an overall majority. I always suspected, although there's actually no evidence for it, that the Conservatives would win an overall majority. One reason because, of course, Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, just wasn't trusted on the economy or to be a competent Prime Minister. So really the polls were wrong, and the media were following a lot of those polls and were not believing that many people within the UK could be capable of supporting the Conservative Party, which of course they did at the general election.
But speaking of the media as well, how did the Conservatives make it, despite, like you said, a lot of centre-left media outlets not giving them enough time, and presenters being really abrupt throughout the campaign and everything, while, like you said, they were more biased towards Labour? But how did this not influence voters, despite all the anti-Conservative tone within mainstream media?
Well, a lot of people's fears about if there were to be a hung parliament and the country would be run effectively by Ed Miliband, being propped up by the Scottish nationalists, Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, that then had an impact. People were then worried about that and voted Conservative. But of course the Conservatives were more trusted on the economy. So despite the BBC's bias, and many Conservatives had said that the BBC had been very biased towards or against the Conservatives, that was overcome because of people's fears about what would happen under a Labour government.
And on the next day we've seen, especially particularly on the BBC, that Labour were given airtime to sort of lament what happened, and while Conservatives even attempted at celebrating it, they were cut short. So Hassan Al-Katib, tell us a little bit about the Muslim vote throughout these general elections here in Britain. Do you agree with some analysts that the terminology itself, the Muslim vote, somehow homogenizes the Muslim community, because it's clearly a fact that not all Muslims voted Labour this time?
Well, of course. I mean, Muslims, as you've picked up on the point, are a heterogeneous community, not a homogeneous community, and they vote for any party they think will be good for them. But it's also important to unite communities, not just Muslim communities, but all sorts of communities, whether it's a student community, black communities, other ethnic communities, white communities, working communities, to get them to vote tactically and strategically when it comes to the elections. It's always best to look at their constituency, their candidates, and vote together as a community for who they feel will be the best person who will be in Parliament. So in a way, it's a good thing, I think, to try and unite Muslims to think strategically and vote for the best person possible. There have been many groups who have tried to do that up and down the country, and I think maybe in some areas it hasn't been felt so much, but there still seems to be quite a few Muslims who will vote blindly, for the Labour Party, and I don't think that will be
Why is that?
a good thing
What's
in
the
the future.
reason between for this affinity
Very
with the
simply,
Labour Party?
very simply, because traditionally, over the past few decades, the Labour Party has been very close to ethnic minorities and the Muslim communities. However, I feel that is now really changed. I think ever since New Labour has come in, it's some of their policies haven't been very, very different from the Conservative Party, and because of that, I think Muslims really need to rethink voting for the Labour Party and voting for someone who actually cares more about the interests not just of Muslims but of the community as a whole. So there needs to be a step away from that, and I think over the years they may mature in doing so.
I must add here that current Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, every year he does address the Muslim community on Eid and he celebrates the diversity in Britain. Back to you, Mr. Earls, the Prime Minister's measures will also on counter-terrorism, on counter-extremism this time, not even terrorism. They will be mentioned in the Queen's speech later this month, and now that's certainly a huge step forward when it comes to Britain's stance on the matter, especially with Britain's reputation being a little bit tarnished with a lot of British extreme Muslim youth going to fight in Iraq and Syria, and they do hold British citizenship. So what do you think of those measures, especially now 1 week into his new term?
Well, we need to look very carefully at them, because always there needs to be actions to be taken to make sure that terrorism is dealt with, that make sure that British people, effectively British citizens, are not getting involved in terrorism, going off to support it or promote it at home within the UK. But at the same time, we need to protect civil liberties as well. So we should always keep a watchful eye on the government to make sure they're not taking away our basic freedoms, which is always a fear. And any party that has a majority in Parliament will have the ability to get legislation through. And people like Theresa May, the Home Secretary, she will want to be pushing through tough measures that arguably have an impact on civil liberties. But of course, the action does need to be taken to restrict terrorists and it's people that would promote terrorism. But let's just make sure that we don't damage basic British values and freedoms that we should cherish.
Do you think that might cause a little bit of an issue, or maybe a bit of a potential row within the Conservative Party when it comes to liberties under such measures?
Yeah, many Conservatives actually are, in a sense, small L liberals. They actually value liberty and freedom and tolerance of other people. That is actually a large part of the Conservative Party, but there's also an authoritarian wing as well, which wants to take measures that will deal with terrorism and law and order, which has traditionally been a strength for the Conservative Party. We've always been known for being strong on law and order and tackling crime and violence and antisocial behaviour. So really there is this clash, but with the Liberal Democrats out of government, because the Conservatives were in coalition from 2010 to 2015, the recent general election, there wasn't really that much the Conservatives could do. But now they have a majority, and will be taking legislation or making legislation as they see fit.
And now let us talk to London-based Muslim Imam Anjem Chowdhury. Welcome to our discussion.
Yes, thank you for having me on your show.
Mr. Chowdhury, what do you think of the new anti-extremism bill, which will be reiterated in the Queen's speech later this month? We have to note here that extremism was mentioned, not terrorism. So, Mr. Chowdhury, where do you draw the line there between extremism and terrorism?
Well, first of all, let me just say that the Muslims who are practicing do not vote in elections. We believe that legislation is only for Allah. So those people who committed this heinous crime of voting for Conservative or Labour now have their comeuppance. Now you have the first proposal from this new regime, which is basically targeting Islam and Muslims. If you look at the report which came out post-Lee Rigby in December 2013, extremism and Islamist extremism in particular has been defined as those people who want the Sharia, those people who believe they're Muslims in terms of identity, those people who believe the British foreign policy is against Islam and Muslims, which any sane person believes, and of course those people who believe in concepts like jihad and khilafah. Now, obviously, you're no longer a Muslim if you don't believe in those basic tenets. And I think that the Muslims and the non-Muslims can see that now that the Conservative Party, have this free reign to introduce their own policies without being fettered by libertarians and others who were with them before, the true face, the ugly nature of this Conservative Party can be seen. Obviously, Cameron already has the blood of Muslims on his hands with the war in Iraq and Syria. And, this idea of labeling people as extremists or fundamentalists or other pejoratives is pretty typical of the Western regimes like America and Britain. Remember, Sheikh Osama bin Laden was a freedom fighter when he was fighting the Russians, then he became a terrorist. But if you look in the dictionary at the word terrorism, it is the use of force or violence against a section of the community for political purposes, which is precisely what the Americans and British are in fact doing in Iraq, in Syria, and in Afghanistan before. And what I would say is that basically what the British government want to do is they do not want to take responsibility for their own heinous foreign policy of occupation and murder, and the reaction to that, whether that be in Britain or elsewhere, by introducing these very harsh and draconian laws. So basically, we are at fault for being bombed in our countries, and we are at fault as well for being arrested in this country without anyone taking any blame.
Mr. Chowdhury, the media reports are asking if someone like yourself is someone who promotes hatred in the country, or if you are a radicalizing force. There are reports today in the media particularly about this. What's your answer?
Well, I would say that I've been active in the Islamic propagation team for about 25 years, and I've never been arrested and charged for any crime whatsoever. The only thing that I've ever actually been charged for is organizing an illegal demonstration in the heart of London because of the cartoons that were depicting the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yes.
So, I have a very clean record. Cressida Dick, who was the head of counterterrorism before, said, I remain within the law. Theresa May has said this. David Cameron has said this before. Even the head of the Metropolitan Police. I think what they have trouble with is that if people obey the law and they say things which are not palatable for the government and their own authorities, we expose their foreign policy, we speak the truth to the youth, this is something which they cannot tolerate. Therefore, it was the absurd statement yesterday from David Cameron who said obeying the law is no longer good enough. And when they mention things like democracy and freedom of expression and freedom of worship, these are the very principles and values which they are trouncing over. And, incidentally, they are the principles which they're fighting us for in Muslim countries.
There are reports.
Why should Muslims adopt them when they're not good enough for them?
Yes, Mr. Chowdhury, there are reports that you personally are linked to a third of people who join ISIS in Syria and Iraq, not just from the UK, but from Norway or other EU countries.
Yes, there have been many of these analyses, hope not hate, which quite frankly has more hate than hope in it. Said I was linked to 500 individuals. Now you have this think tank in America saying 1/3. I would say that there's a difference between having an affiliation and having an affinity.
Right.
There's no administrative link or affiliation between me and people around Europe and around the world. We don't have a kind of administrative meetings. And certainly those people who believe in the Sharia, who believe that Muslim land needs to be liberated, who want the Khilafah, we have an affinity with each other, and they happen to be a minority. We say in Arabic, this is the ghuraba, the strangers. And definitely you will seek each other out and you will support each other. So we have a lot of support on the social media. They listen to some of my talks around Europe and around the world. So that doesn't mean that, we have some kind of link with each other. But definitely, you will end up following each other and listening to talks. And obviously those people who want to make something of that, they can make whatever they want.
Yes. And Mr. Robert from the Bruges Foundation, Mr. Robert Olds here would perhaps like to add on this.
Well, Amjad Chowdhury, of course, mentioned Iraq and Syria, but the biggest foreign policy failure of David Cameron was, of course, Libya, where the British Army or the Air Force with other Western European countries and the support of the United States overthrew a secular regime, creating a political vacuum where people who are extremists came to power, people of which Amjad Chowdhury may well have some affiliation with ideologically, such as ISIS-linked groups who have murdered 21 Christians in Libya recently. So his biggest foreign policy failure of David Cameron was not Iraq or Syria. Of course, he did want to get involved in Syria, arguably on the wrong side. But of course his biggest foreign policy failure was Libya, where a secular regime was overthrown, creating a political vacuum where terrorists did come to power and Islamic fundamentalists.
Mr. Chowdhury, are you concerned that your and other Muslim groups' activities here on UK soil and your speeches might have to be quelled now with the new measures?
Actually, I have two points on this. First of all, we didn't start propagating Islam and calling for the Sharia because, Brown or Blair or even Cameron said that we could. And we're certainly not going to stop because they bring in these draconian measures. The second thing I would say is that I've been around long enough to see a whole raft of very harsh measures and laws which have been drafted in. I've been arrested over 5 times for supposedly being a member of a prescribed organization. I've had my house raided several times, but it never fazed me, it never stopped me. And I think that in the ideological and political struggle between ideas, if you believe in something, you're willing to sacrifice for it. So, I'm a firmly of the belief that whatever happens to me in this life, I will get the reward for this on the day of judgment. And my enemies can do nothing to me. If they imprison me, I will continue my activities in prison. If they deport me, that will be hijrah, emigration for the sake of Allah. If they kill me, I will become martyr and shaheed. You already have people in the BBC, Mark Easton, for example, yesterday, who were talking about people like Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi, who were similarly silenced and treated as terrorists until they realized, in fact, that they were eating their own laws, which they are supposedly trying to propagate around the world. And they woke up to that reality. So I think one day people will realize that democracy and freedom are fallacies. The flip side of democracy is very often dictatorship.
Mr. Anjem Choudhury, British Muslim social and political activist, previously a solicitor and chairman of the Society of Muslim Lawyers. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Mr. Al-Khatib, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think
the comparison with Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela.
Well, never mind that. Just look at what the Conservative Party are heading towards, the direction they're heading towards, and if you look at the people around the Conservative Party at the moment and the government, there is a high presence of Zionist neoconservatives who are in the highest echelons of the Conservative Party right now, who are trying to get the party to move in a certain direction, which is, of course, not just to clamp down on extremists like Anjem Choudhury, for instance, or anyone else, but more to try and quell the kind of opposition or ideological opposition towards their foreign policy and other domestic policies, specifically the Muslim community. And I think there's a problem here when you don't properly define extremism. That's a huge problem. The government really hasn't done that at the moment. They really haven't defined British values. If I ask Rob, what are British values? What are British values? Are they defined? Do we have a piece of paper where we have a list of British values? We don't. And that's quite problematic, because if the government can just hold someone and put them into prison and call them an extremist, they can do so under literally any explanation or any definition they can come out with. So I think and it's not just Anjem Choudhury or particularly the Muslims who are extremists. There's many other groups. Like, for instance, we've had before the English Defence League, and now there's Britain First, and there's other fascist and racist organisations who are still operating in Britain today, and there's other extremist organisations. What about those particular groups? Why aren't the government targeting them? Just the other day there was someone who wanted to kill Prince Charles using a sniper. He's probably part of other people who are like him as well. So why is the government not focusing on them? And I think if they should do more to try, if they want to really combat extremism, they should try and do more to try and define what exactly is extreme and what they could do to try and counter this. But if they really wanted to counter extremism, I think the British government may be locking themselves up, because they've done a lot in terms of exporting extremism around the world and supporting dictatorships like Saudi Arabia and other groups that are linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So this is a problematic thing for the government.
Home Secretary Theresa May brought a very important point that perhaps the EU has overlooked throughout their migrant resettlement plan. Mrs. May pointed out it would leave a stain on Britain's conscience to keep accepting migrants in Europe, which would encourage migrants to put their lives in the hands of reckless human traffickers. She challenges EU diplomat Federica Mogherinis, saying she is wrong, saying that migrants shouldn't be returned against their will. Mr. Oels of the Bruges Group, what do you have to say about this, particularly when Mrs. May challenged Federica Mogherini and believes migrants should go back? to where they came from?
Well, at the moment, there's a whole host of pull factors. There's push factors that have been created in North African countries. One, of course, of those reasons that these countries have been destabilised by Western governments, and policies were in place to deal with migration. Those governments have now been destroyed, and there's a political vacuum, government vacuum, and people are making perilous journeys across the Mediterranean. But there's also the pull factors. If we keep on encouraging more migrants to come here, making often a deadly journey across the Mediterranean, then more lives will be lost. We need to be dealing with this issue by tackling it at source, but encouraging more migration is actually going to be counterproductive. It's going to actually just be a situation where there'll be more people crossing the Mediterranean, trying to get into Italy, and then from there into northern European countries, and that will be undermining our own social cohesion and community cohesion within countries like Britain, because really there's been a lot of immigration, and it is a big issue within the UK. So these things need to be tackled, but it can't be tackled by taking on more migrants when we don't really have the resources to be dealing with it. And of course, ultimately, it's just the human traffickers, the people smugglers that are profiting from this. But people would be then coming to the UK or other European nations, often in being exploited in very poor situations where they're being used in work, not getting a decent wage, kept in awful conditions. That's even if they make the journey across, because sometimes, as we know, people have been killed trying to get to Italy or Malta when they're trying to cross the Mediterranean, and this really does need to be tackled.
Why did the EU why did they overlook this, the EU?
Well, the EU is very slow. It's not particularly a competent organisation, and it encourages the free movement of people between member states. So, of course, if someone arrives in one country, it's very easy for them to get into another, to get into, say, Italy or other southern European nations where there's very little economic opportunities. But from there, once they've managed to land, they can easily get to another country, be that Germany, the Netherlands, even the UK and France as well, where they can take advantage of better economic conditions with growing economies and try and have some degree of prosperity. Often they might be escaping very poor living conditions, but really it's because of the incompetence of the European Union and the fact that they have open borders in the first place.
Mr. Al-Khatib, where is the thin line, back to what Mr. Chowdhury was saying, where's the thin line between radically religious Muslims in Britain and an extremist individual willing to go against the policies of Britain and fight with a terror group in Syria or Iraq? And do you think the current government would struggle to draw the line there, like you mentioned a little bit earlier? But you tell us, where is the thin line?
Apart from defining extremism, which I think would be a very big step in tackling that particular issue, there are signs, there are indications whether or not someone will be who could go and fight for terrorist groups. You can track them down, you can monitor them. There's another way, is there are people who publicly, come out in support of these particular groups and their ideologies, and they, not just support it, but they also help to facilitate other people going over there. That is the first indication. The second indication, people who actually want to go there and fight, or who have gone there and fought, or have come back. That's the line, I think, for me, is people who have actively gone over there, or who have actively supported and facilitated and financed, or have encouraged people to go over there to fight. That is, I think, the line. If someone has become, if you like, religious, or become a zealot, or has certain views which maybe are not, unacceptable for other people, I mean, that's one thing. The other thing is to be actually actively involved in militarism. Is the line I think the government should be looking at in trying to tackle extremism, because if they are going to just clamp down on anyone who thinks differently to them, then there really isn't. I think it's going to have a backfire on them. It's going to have a very adverse effect. People are going to be alienated even more. They're going to be extreme even more, and it's actually going to encourage people to go and fight even more. So I think the line should be for people who actively do. Support these terrorist groups and call for people going over there fighting there.
Mr. Oulz, do you see the growth of terrorism and the rhetoric of Mr. Chowdhury and other similar people on UK soil? Do you see it as some others perhaps see it as in the aftermath of the previous Labour government's policies towards those groups?
Well, Mr. Chowdhury speaks for very few people. He called voting in an election a heinous crime. That's ridiculous. Of course, I'd argue that people are very misguided if they vote Labour, but for arguing they shouldn't be voting Conservative for me is a step too far. Of course, in the Conservative Party, you've got Muslims at the forefront, like Safid Javid, who's thought of as potentially being a future leader. Of course, that'll have to possibly be after David Cameron and perhaps after Boris Johnson as well. But there are Muslims within the Conservative Party. Nuzgani, who I know. She, of course, is a newly elected MP that possibly has a very bright future, but many Muslim people do not follow Amjad Chowdhury. They partake in elections, and many people of Muslim background are also conservative, because many are entrepreneurial and, of course, socially conservative with a small c. But a lot of the problems do, I think, come from the last Labour government, and Hassan put his finger on it, talking about what are British values. That's something that has been denigrated after years of left-wing Labour governments, and we don't have this shared common identity anymore. And when there's economic problems and when people feel alienated from society, and society isn't actually offering people a sense of belonging, then they will search for other forms of identity. And that's one of the reasons I think people have gone down this route, just a very small minority, of becoming radicalised. Now, of course, I also agree that we shouldn't be monitoring people's Facebook unless they are a known threat. Just because someone likes something on Facebook shouldn't mean that they're going to be persecuted. But what we should be cracking down on is, of course, those people who are promoting violence and promoting extremism, which for me, extremism is about hurting someone, it's about taking violent action. That is extremism, and people promoting that should be discouraged, because, of course, there are always going to be limits on freedom of speech, but we shouldn't be just attacking someone or persecuting them or having legal restrictions placed on them just because they have a certain view. It's only if they promote hurting other people, in my opinion. We do need this common sense of belonging. We do need a sense of Britishness that everybody can buy into, regardless of what background you're from and what religion you are.
Speaking of the Britishness and promoting this sense of Britishness, do you think there's a bit too much tolerance, especially recently, which was really criticised in the media on behalf of the Labour Party, top figures attending a gender-segregated event in Birmingham recently before the elections? So do you think such tolerance to values that are foreign to the country, even though they are British, do you think that drives some radicals to think that, okay, the Labour government is all right with this, because they attended a gender-segregated event, for instance, in Birmingham recently, so they are to our side, they have affinity to what we believe in, and then they take it to another level, not those groups, of course, but I'm talking about other people like Mr. Amjad Chowdhury. So, while, for example, the Conservative Party doesn't have such tolerance.
Well, I think that the storm over those gender-segregated events was somewhat overblown. These are just a number of events, and there's many events like that within the UK. Of course, we shouldn't be discriminating against people on grounds of their gender, but I think just because people are sitting on another side of the room at two events in Birmingham, I don't think that's the biggest issue. But one of the British values I always thought was about tolerance. Respecting people and giving people freedom of speech and conscience within the law. People can do pretty much what they like as long as it's not prescribed or banned by the laws, statute made by our democratically elected parliament that can be overturned and reviewed. So really, a British value is tolerance, and we need to be welcoming people and engaging people and welcome them into our society, but also saying that we have a sense of loyalty to the British state, not to ISIS, as Amjad Chowdhury declared his loyalty to the self-appointed caliph, the leader of ISIS. That's, of course, just a leader of a terrorist organisation in reality. Our loyalty should, of course, be to the British state and perhaps even Her Majesty the Queen, but that we can discuss that. But really, that's where people's society belongs. But on equal footing, British people also need to show tolerance to those who have different religions.
And now moving on to Camp David, where the lack of participation by Gulf Cooperation Council leaders has been widely perceived as a sign that many of its members are displeased with what the US is offering and want to convey displeasure at various administration policies, including talks with Iran over its nuclear program. Only the leaders of Qatar and Kuwait are attending, with the King of Saudi Arabia cancelling at the last minute and Bahrain's king attending the Royal Windsor Horse Show in the UK. while there he is expected to be meeting with the Queen. However, at the summit kickoff Wednesday, there were no signs of tension as President Barack Obama welcomed two officials from Saudi Arabia to the White House, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef and Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Both US administration officials and Saudi government aides said there was no snub intended by Saudi King Salman's withdrawal of his over the weekend last minute. Hassan Al-Khatib, do you believe, like other analysts, that Gulf heads of states substituting their presence by more junior leaders should be seen as a rebuff to President Obama's talks with Iran over its nuclear ambitions?
Exactly that, and that's what they intend to
Even though
show
they denied it.
Well, they want to show to America and the P5+1 that they are not happy with the way the American government are trying to have a deal with Iran, because they feel that if there is a deal in the future, with the sanctions being lifted possibly, that Iran could be a big player in the region, and it could be in the market again, and they don't want to see their power being lost towards Iran. And then that's a signal, a message they want to send, that they do not want to see more Iranian influence in the region. And as we've seen over the past few years, Saudi Arabia have failed in Iraq, they failed in Syria, they failed in Yemen. Their power is slowly starting to be lost in the Middle East, and they're panicking. They're also very worried about the repercussions that could have on their influence in the future. And there have been many analysts, such as Chris Davidson, who wrote a book about the coming fall of the Arab monarchies. And I think in the next few years, that could be, something which we will be seeing more of, that the Arab dictatorships will have their power lost.
You talk about Chris Davidson of Durham University.
Yes.
Oh, he was a bit hopeful there, but you seem to completely agree.
Yes.
But anyway, Robert, would you agree on that?
Yes,
the fall of the Arab states, was it the title?
Well, the Arab monarchies,
Monarchy.
many of these are corrupt. They're involved in persecutions, have dreadful human rights
How
records.
would they fall, though? How would they fall?
Well, Bahrain would have fallen if, of course, there wasn't a Saudi intervention. And I think a lot of Saudi policy, or really it's the policy of what, in a sense, a mafia that runs the state that call themselves a monarchy. They have a dreadful human rights record. Of course, that never bothers the United States, who often speaks about human rights, but they turn a blind eye when it comes to Saudi Arabia. Many of these people within the Gulf states have been no, not necessarily the states, but individuals who are very prominent have been funding these groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Their birthplace it comes from there, of course, as well as funding extremists in Afghanistan as well. They're involved in destabilization, and they're trying to encourage the United States in a proxy war against Iran. And we need to remember that Iran is not an imperialist power. It hasn't invaded another country in 200 years. Iran wants peaceful engagement with other countries. It wants to have its own sovereignty protected. It's not pursuing a nuclear weapons program. It has a right to a nuclear program.
It is an ideological threat to Israel, though.
Well, I think the main threat to Israel will come from its own demographic problems. Israel has some serious demographic issues, is that the Palestinian population, the Arab population, not just within the West Bank and Gaza is growing massively, but also within Israel as well. And at some point that will become as much as 1/3 within the pre-1967 borders of Israel. And then the whole Jewish state question becomes put into question. The concept of a Jewish state becomes unviable when large parts of even the Negev desert, a very large part of Israel, are about to become Arab majority. So I think Israel isn't directly threatened by Iran. There's a lot of hysteria from, I think, almost an unholy alliance between Israel and these corrupt monarchies of the Arab states, who are, in a sense, allied in their opposition to Iran and have a common enemy there for their own reasons, to have their own hegemony within the area, and of course for the persecution of the Shia people. And I think we need to remember that Saudi Arabia is an oil-rich country, but of course the oil is actually under the ground of where the Shias live. It's not actually the Saudi monarchy's oil. Arguably, the oil in Saudi Arabia should perhaps belong to the people who walk and live above the oil. So really there is an economic persecution element, I think, behind the Saudi policy. and they just want to create conflict, whereas other nations, and including Iran, want, I think, positive engagement.
And I think just to add to that, President Obama even said himself that the real problem lies within Saudi Arabia. There's a huge unemployment. There are people who are living in poverty. There is a lot of number of groups who feel politically disenfranchised from the system, and something could be really bubbling under the surface in the future if nothing is really done to sort the major problems out in Saudi Arabia. We could see more uprisings, and who knows, a coup could be underway. Look what happened in Yemen. No one saw that a place where there was a lot of Saudi influence and American influence, and look, it's completely now out of their hands. So that could very well be the same picture across the Arab countries.
Speaking of Yemen, now let me welcome Yemen specialist Fernando Carvajal talking to us from Los Angeles, California. Welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you for having me, Carl.
Tell us a little bit about the humanitarian ceasefire in Yemen and your thoughts on the overall handling of the key players there. And do you think the issue is being addressed at Camp David this week?
I think that the ceasefire is holding as far as the principle of allowing for humanitarian aid to be delivered to over 10 million Yemenis suffering from a fuel crisis, lack of access to foodstuffs, from the capital Sana'a to Aden in the southern port. The fighting still continues. There are reports of fighting in Ib, in Marib, in Taiz, Al-Baida, Aden.
Yeah.
And the only city that seems to be spared at the moment of any violence is the capital Sana'a. But this mainly has to do with the arrival of the new UN special envoy to Yemen, Mr. Ismail Sheikh Ahmed, who arrived Tuesday evening just before the ceasefire began, and he left this evening of Thursday from Sana'a. The delivery of food and fuel seems to be going according to plan. But other sources in Yemen doubt that the food and the fuel can actually be delivered to the people that really need it beyond the major cities of Aden and Sana'a. As far as Camp David, the talks in Camp David, we can say that all parties are in agreement that the Saudi campaign targeting the Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh himself, the former president, has been successful to a limited degree of success in holding the Houthis from strengthening their own positions. This was stated Wednesday when the group of 14 embassies met in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, mainly to discuss the humanitarian situation, but coincidentally they stressed their support for the military campaign against the Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh, calling both parties to refrain from aggression, to withdraw from major cities, to withdraw from government institutions, and to re-engage dialogue.
Mr. Caraval, now that the new UN envoy in Sana'a, Ismail Ould Sheikh Ahmed, has visited Sana'a, what is he going to bring to the table, in your opinion?
Well, he's a new face representing the UN after the former envoy Jamal bin Omar was highly criticized, and now he is in New York. Unfortunately, as other analysts continue to comment, Mr. Ismail is a UN representative and continues the line, the approach established by Mr. bin Omar, which means that the political transition program that was agreed upon in November 2011 is the pillar for moving forward, even though many of the parties in Sana'a and Yemen disagree with this path. Mr. Ismail has a tough road ahead, mainly because Saudi Arabia has strengthened its position, leading the transition process. Saudi Arabia insists that the dialogue among all Yemeni parties must take place in Riyadh, while the UN has opened up the possibility of moving talks to Geneva, much like former President Ali Abdullah Saleh proposed a couple of weeks ago.
Fernando Carvajal, PhD candidate in Arab Islamic Studies at Exeter University here in England. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Carl.
And Mr. Olds, do you agree with Mr. Carvajal about what he just said about Iran and Yemen and Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia has got involved fighting the Houthi, the so-called rebels. But of course, really, the real benefit of this would be Al Qaeda and ISIS. There's groups there, Al Qaeda in the Yemen, in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen. There's also an ISIS-affiliated group. Of course, the Houthi rebels would arguably be an ally in the fight against ISIS and Al Qaeda. But of course, the Saudi Arabian forces would not go in without US approval. So I really do think that, again, it's another wrong-headed policy backing Saudi intervention, which would further destabilise the country. And I'm sure now that these Al Qaeda, these really extremist linked groups, will now come even more to the fore and create even more problems, which the United States had been trying to deal with. But of course, Saudi Arabia has a somewhat confused attitude towards them, and sometimes even supportive.
Hassan al-Khatib, the talks in Camp David aim at reassuring the Arab allies, the American allies, the Arab states. On Iran particularly, what is it exactly that those states want in terms of reassurance?
Well, of course, the main thing is that they want reassurance that Iran will not be a big player, a massive player, an influential player in the region. The attacks on Yemen is a big sign of desperation for Saudi Arabia. What we've seen over the past few years now is that Saudi Arabia is doing its utmost, putting in billions, giving to terrorists and other groups to try and destabilize Iran's influence in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, and they're failing there now in Yemen. And the last thing they want is to see Iran have the upper hand with a deal with America. And so this is something which they're worried about, not just them, but also Israel in the region. They do not want to see sanctions lifted from Iran. This is the key part of this particular deal. However, having said all that, there is actually no real reassurance that the sanctions will be lifted from Iran after this deal, if it was to be made. And that's a huge problem for Iran, obviously, because the sanctions actually is illegal. It's targeting the people there, and it has a catastrophic consequences. But one of the main reasons is that they want Saudi Arabia and Israel, and also America and the West, want to see sanctions still imposed on Iran. They want to try and cripple Iran and trying to do as much as they can to deter them from becoming more independent, from gaining more power, and being an influential player in the region.
Mr. Olds, without speculating, speaking about Iran and this whole thing there, could we think there will be, or there could be, a side deal in Camp David where the US will leave Saudi Arabia, will have this sort of laissez-faire attitude when it comes to Yemen, and at the same time get away without upsetting them too much while they are due eventually by the end of June to sign a nuclear deal with Iran and perhaps lift sanctions, although the deal might not be a binding deal, so after Barack Obama, any other cabinet might cancel the deal. So what's the importance of that deal given that? And back to my question, do you think there'll be a side deal there?
Well, about the sanctions, of course, there can be an agreement between Iran and the other nations, but of course, would the sanctions be lifted, especially because, of course, they need the actual approval of the American Congress to get them taken away. And that is unlikely to be forthcoming, and there's a presidential election coming up next year in the United States, and the American politics is unfortunately in the grip of neocons who are very antagonistic, very even aggressive towards Iran, and do not want to see any kind of agreement, and want to have the sanctions kept in place, because really the wider aim is, of course, regime change. Some people in America are open about that, and making sure they have their global hegemony and control over foreign policy issues. So any agreement over sanctions, I think, is unlikely to be forthcoming, because unfortunately I don't think America can be trusted here because of its own political internal issues and the need for a future American president and Congress as well, just to be antagonistic and to be incredibly hawkish and following what Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, wants to see put in place, which is, of course, a continuation of the sanction. He was given, he was lauded when he came to speak to the US Senate. So I'm very sceptical about there being a deal on that in the long run, and with the lifting of sanctions and finding a resolution to this problem. Of course, just Iran's future is probably best looking at other markets and really not being able to trust the United States, look to emerging markets around the world, China trying to make trade deals with other countries so that it can have its economic prosperity free of American control. So I'm not sure there would be a deal. With regards to Yemen and the agreements there, Again, I think Saudi Arabia cannot be trusted to be a peaceful player within this, because they're fighting a larger proxy war. They're trying to get America in on this, which doesn't really need much encouragement, and they're always trying to attack Iran and anybody that may be close to Iran, and of course Shia people as well.
Speaking of the Shia people, what do you think of, while this summit coincides with a humanitarian ceasefire agreed by Saudi Arabia, what do you think of the Houthi rebels handling there? Because they broke the ceasefire, they broke the truce.
Well, I mean, you have to put this into context. For many decades now, Saudi Arabia and America have been meddling inside Yemen. They've been trying, to influence the politics there, and which has had a very negative effect inside Yemen itself. So over ever since the uprising in 2011 till now, the Yemeni people have tried to sort out the internal politics. And Ansarullah, the Houthi rebel group, have done quite a lot in trying to sit at the table with the then government, and also parties which involved Saudi Arabia and America, and they've done a lot to try and resolve some of the problems, but because of the Saudi and American influence in the country, they've prevented that, and in fact they've had an adverse effect on Yemen, and Ansarullah have then said, well, this is it, we will try and bring the country together, and if that means having a coup, then so be it, because the country was heading towards more problems, and this is a Yemeni revolution, this is a Yemeni uprising, and this is the Yemeni people speaking and having their way, and I think it's important to listen to the Yemeni people, because if that doesn't happen, then the country will be in further turmoil in the future.
Mr. Oz, my last question. Were the Prime Minister of England in Camp David today, had it been his country, obviously, what would you have liked him, and how would you have liked him to address the Gulf leaders on this occasion?
He needs to be very stern with them, needs to make sure they cease funding terrorism. We know that in Qatar that there's money going towards funding ISIS, Al-Qaeda.
Can you really upset Qatar, though, in England specifically, given their huge investments here, especially in London?
Well, we really need to turn away from the failed old alliances with these corrupt monarchies that will hopefully be overthrown quite soon, but perhaps not, and because they're funding terrorism. And if there was really a strong will within Western countries such as the United States or Britain, then the same actions they're taking against Iran, trying to cut them off from the international financial system, trying to take away their reserves, they'd actually be doing that against some of these Gulf states and the people there that are funding the terrorist groups. But of course they just welcome these leaders with open arms, just in the sake so they can speculate on the London property market and inflate prices even higher, which is good for some people, but in some areas of London it's actually becoming hollowed out, and some areas of London are becoming depopulated because there's so much money coming in from many of these Gulf states that it's just really transforming them, and meaning that the communities are slowly
demographics are being changed.
Yeah, slowly dying, because many people aren't engaging in the wider community if they're just coming here to take advantage of the non-dom status so they can get out of paying taxes.
As this episode comes to an end, I'd like to thank our interlocutors who joined us today. Mr. Fernando Caraval, researcher at the University of Exeter, joined us from Los Angeles. Mr. Anjem Chowdhury, British political activist, and of course our guest here at the studio, Mr. Robert Oels of the Bruges Group, and Mr. Hassan El-Kateb, journalist and political commentator. Thank you very much for your input, and stay tuned, and I'll be with you again soon. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.
home within the UK, but at the same time we need to protect civil liberties as well. So we should always keep a watchful eye on the government to make sure they're not taking away our basic freedoms, which is always a fear. And any party that has a majority in Parliament will have the ability to get legislation through, and people like Theresa May, the Home Secretary, she will want to be pushing through tough measures that arguably will have an impact on civil liberties. But of course, the action does need to be taken to restrict terrorists and it's people that would promote terrorism, but let's just make sure that we don't damage basic British values and freedoms that we should cherish.
Do you think that might cause a little bit of an issue or maybe a bit of a potential row within the Conservative Party when it comes to liberties under such measures?
Yeah, many Conservatives actually are, in a sense, small L liberals. They actually value liberty and freedom and tolerance of other people. That is actually a large part of the Conservative Party, but there's also an authoritarian wing as well, which wants to take measures that will deal with terrorism and law and order, which has traditionally been a strength for the Conservative Party. Always been known for being strong on law and order and tackling crime and violence and antisocial behaviour. So really there is this clash. But with the Liberal Democrats out of government, because the Conservatives were in coalition from 2010 to 2015, the recent general election, there wasn't really that much the Conservatives could do. But now they have a majority and will be taking legislation or making legislation as they see fit.
And now let us talk to London-based Muslim Imam Anjem Chowdhury. Welcome to our discussion.
Very simply, because traditionally, over the past few decades, the Labour Party has been very close to ethnic minorities and the Muslim communities. However, I feel that is now really changed. I think ever since New Labour has come in, it's some of their policies haven't been very different from the Conservative Party, and because of that, I think Muslims really need to rethink voting for the Labour Party and voting for someone who actually cares more about the interests not just of Muslims but of the community as a whole. So there needs to be a step away from that, and I think over the years they may mature in doing so.
I must add here that current Prime Minister Mr Cameron, every year he does address the Muslim community on Eid and he celebrates the diversity in Britain. Back to you, Mr Earls, the Prime Minister's measures will also on counter-terrorism, on counter-extremism this time, not even terrorism. They will be mentioned in the Queen's speech later this month, and now that's certainly a huge step forward when it comes to Britain's stance on the matter, especially with Britain's reputation being a little bit tarnished with a lot of British extreme Muslim youth going to fight in Iraq and Syria, and they do hold British citizenship. So what do you think of those measures, especially now 1 week into his new term?
Well, we need to look very carefully at them because always there needs to be actions to be taken to make sure that terrorism is dealt with, that make sure that British people, effectively British citizens, are not getting involved in terrorism, going off to support it or promote it.
Of what is happening, of what happened with the results?
Well, many media outlets within the UK are really left of centre, and they have a liberal left bias and are not necessarily in favour of the Conservatives. But there was a lot of polling information which was suggesting it was going to be a hung parliament where no party has an overall majority. I always suspected, although there's actually no evidence for it, that the Conservatives would win an overall majority. One reason because, of course, Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, just wasn't trusted on the economy or to be a competent Prime Minister. So really the polls were wrong, and the media were following a lot of those polls and were not believing that many people within the UK could be capable of supporting the Conservative Party, which of course they did at the general election.
But speaking of the media as well, how did the Conservatives make it, despite, like you said, a lot of centre-left media outlets not giving them enough time and presenters being really abrupt throughout the campaign and everything, while, like you said, they were more biased towards Labour? But how did this not influence voters despite all the anti-Conservative tone within mainstream media?
Well, a lot of people's fears about if there were to be a hung parliament and the country would be run effectively by Ed Miliband, being propped up by the Scottish nationalists, Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, that then had an impact. People were then worried about that and voted Conservative. But of course the Conservatives were more trusted on the economy. So despite the BBC's bias, and many Conservatives had said that the BBC had been very biased towards or against the Conservatives, that was overcome because of people's fears about what would happen under a Labour government.
And on the next day we've seen, especially particularly on the BBC, that Labour were given airtime to sort of lament what happened. And while Conservatives even attempted at celebrating it, they were cut short. So Hassan Al-Katib, tell us a little bit about the Muslim vote throughout these general elections here in Britain. Do you agree with some analysts that the terminology itself, the Muslim vote, somehow homogenizes the Muslim community, because it's clearly a fact that not all Muslims voted Labour this time?
Well, of course, I mean, Muslims, as you've picked up on the point, are a heterogeneous community, not a homogeneous community, and they vote for any party they think will be good for them. But it's also important to unite communities, not just Muslim communities, but all sorts of communities, whether it's a student community, black communities, other ethnic communities, white communities, working communities, to get them to vote tactically and strategically when it comes to the elections. It's always best to look at their constituency, their candidates, and vote together as a community for who they feel will be the best person who will be in Parliament. So in a way, it's a good thing, I think, to try and unite Muslims to think strategically and vote for the best person possible. There have been many groups who've tried to do that up and down the country, and I think maybe in some areas it hasn't been felt so much. But there still seems to be quite a few, Muslims who will vote blindly, for the Labour Party, and I don't think that will be
Why is that?
a good thing.
What's
in
the
future.
reason between
Well, because
for this effect? Hello and welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political talk show shedding light on things that matter in the Middle East. Foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council, a union of the oil-rich monarchies of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar and the UAE met Tuesday night and agreed that though they weren't getting everything they wanted from the US, they are going to build on what they are getting. They want this to be the first of a regular summit, with the next one in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia next year. Meanwhile, in Yemen, Houthi rebels are accused of violating Yemen's ceasefire, but Saudi Arabia says it will stick to the truce. And here in Britain, the Conservatives have won against all odds, as the BBC claims. I don't know which odds they mean. Mr. Cameron is in for another term, only a week after his victory. The Prime Minister is adamant in a crackdown on extremism, which will be part of the Queen's speech this month. First of all, I'd like to welcome our guest here at the studio in London, Mr. Robert Olds of the Bush Foundation, and Mr. Hassan Al-Katib, journalist and political analyst. Thank you very much for coming as well. Mr. Olds, let's start in Britain and with what's happening with the Conservative win last week. And, the other media outlets were saying all the time against all odds. So how come the odds didn't really, they weren't really predicted?